Hey, well, welcome guys, and welcome to some new people that I can see here. It is good to have you with us this morning. My name is Frank, and with my wife Amy, we pastor here at Welcome Bay Community Church, and it's good to have you with us today. For those that weren't here yesterday, the lovely lady to my right was Rebecca. Amy and I have been friends with Bex and her husband Tiu for almost 10 years now. We went to Bible college together, and so her and her husband shared their testimony yesterday. If you missed it, that's unfortunate for you, but you're more than welcome to catch up with her afterwards and just hear a little bit about their incredible story. But we're blessed to have you guys. It's so nice to have you in our church. Well, let's see if this is working. Oh, that'd help if I put the power on. There we go. So this morning, I want to share with you guys a spiritual discipline that I've been kind of looking into and am trying to implement into my life a bit more. By no means am I an expert in this area, and to be honest, there are many weeks where I just prioritize my to-do list, as many of us do. I get caught up in the busyness of life and work, and so I am with you. If this feels like a struggle, if this is unfamiliar to you, then I am right beside you in this. But this was a discipline that was essential to the life of Jesus, to his ministry, to much of the early church, but is probably unfamiliar to many Christians today because it's utterly countercultural to our society, and it's called solitude. And I want you to imagine for a moment that this jar represents your life. So you and I, we live in a little bit messy, we've all got a little bit of stuff. But you and I live in the busiest and the noisiest period of human history ever. And this hurried, busy, noisy pace that has now become the norm leaves our mind and our body and our soul feeling a little bit like the contents of this jar. All churned up, all uneasy, all chaotic, in turmoil, whatever the words you want to put to it. And solitude is the process by which we just allow ourselves to settle in stillness and in silence with God. And so, like I said, I'm still trying to figure this out, so I'm not going to give you what I think about it. Let me tell you what some of the more expert people have to say about the importance of solitude to the Christian life. Just click on this. So Henry Nouwen once said, "Without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. We do not take the spiritual life seriously if we do not set aside some time to be with God and to listen to Him." Dallas Willard said, you rarely find any person who has made great progress in the spiritual life who did not at some point have much time in solitude and in silence. Ruth Haley Barton has a fantastic book, and in it about solitude, and she writes, "Solitude is an invitation to enter more deeply into the intimacy of relationship with the one who waits just outside the noisiness and the busyness of our lives." And St. John of the Cross wrote, "Our greatest need is to be silent before this great God, for the only language he hears is the silent language of love." Now, we believe that God is omnipresent, meaning that he is everywhere at the same time. But if you want to encounter him on that personal, heart-to-heart, one-to-one level, the Bible tells us that he is most often found in the stillness and in the quiet place. And my favorite Elijah story takes place in 1 Kings chapter 19. And it's right after he's just called down fire from heaven, and he's shown all of Israel that Yahweh is the one true God of Israel. And so then he slaughters the 450 priests of Baal. And then shortly after this, he makes the long journey south to Mount Sinai, seeking an encounter with God. And even though he's had this, top of the mountain experience and has seen much success and stuff, when we read of him in 1 Kings chapter 19, we find Elijah feeling tired, feeling discouraged, feeling alone. He is questioning the point of life and Why should I even bother to continue, Lord? Why not just take my life now? He has come to the end of himself, and God invites him up onto the mountain to meet with him. And it says in verse 11 that the Lord told Elijah, "Go out and stand before me on the mountain." And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind there was an earthquake, but again the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake there was a fire, but the Lord again was not in the fire. And after the fire there was the sound of a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And a voice said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now what fascinates me about this story is the fact that God had appeared in these same manifestations at this very mountain some 600 years earlier in the time of Moses. And so in Exodus chapter 19 we read of God appearing before all of Israel in these forms. He comes as this mighty storm with rushing wind and roaring thunder and lightning. He comes in the form of fire that consumes this mountain, and it says that there is smoke bellowing forth from the mountain. And he comes as an earthquake that violently shakes the mountain and all the land around it, and it instills this fear of God into the hearts of the people as they witness this. And so one would expect, reading this story, that God would once again appear in the same way to Elijah, but he doesn't. Instead, he comes in the sound of a gentle whisper, or as another translation puts it, in the sound of sheer silence. It was in the stillness and the silence that Elijah encountered God. And it's been said that God dwells in silence, and that silence is his language. It's the language that he speaks. Yet, you and I, we live in a society where, by all means possible, we try to avoid times of stillness and silence. And I was reading about this study that was done a while back where participants had to sit in silence for just 15 minutes, but at any point they could stop this process by pressing a button that would then deliver a painful electric shock to their bodies. 92% of the participants chose to shock themselves rather than to wait 15 minutes in silence. And I think sometimes it's the fear that can drive us to busy ourselves. The fear of being alone with our thoughts can sometimes actually be the noisiest place or the most intimidating place we could ever find ourselves, and so we do everything to avoid that. And sometimes I think it's just habit of the modern life. Like whenever you're alone or you're waiting for something or you're waiting for someone, how often do you actually just wait and do nothing? I know for myself, very rarely, and why would I? Because I can instantly pull out my phone, I can check texts, I can check emails, I can open social media, I could read the news, I could read a book, I could read the Bible, be all spiritual, I could listen to music or put on a podcast or just play a game, because we love to be entertained and we love to feel productive with our time and to keep ourselves busy, and so we really find ourselves in times of silence and stillness. And I know for myself that often when I even spend time with God, it's in a very entertaining or a very productive way, whether it's putting on Christian music, or whether it's reading my Bible, or it's listening to the latest sermon or the latest podcast or whatever it is. And obviously these are good practices. We should, continue to do these. But what if Elijah had been in that cave with his guitar, just pouring out his heart in worship, strumming away and lifting his voice in song? Do you think he would have heard that gentle whisper? Or if he'd had his AirPods in and he was listening to last week's sermon or the latest podcast or the latest audiobook or whatever it may be, would he have noticed God appear in the sheer silence? The question is, how many moments have we missed where God wanted to meet with you and with me and to speak to us, but we were distracted by the doing instead of just actually being with God? Where maybe we were looking for him in the wind or in the fire or in the earthquake, when God dwells in the silence. Psalm 46:10, a verse that we all know and have heard before. Be still and know that I am God. So as uncomfortable, as foreign, as unproductive silence and stillness may seem to you, the biblical authors and many of the early church fathers tell us that this is where we encounter God. Mother Teresa once said, "We need to find God, and he cannot be found in noise and restlessness. God is the friend of silence." What if the greatest threat to Christianity today is not secularism, it's not liberalism or any of the other isms that we hear of? What if it's distraction? What if it's busyness and the noise of life? Has anyone read C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters? Yeah, some of it. So in it, basically, Lewis imagines an older demon mentoring a younger demon through a series of letters. And so in one of the letters, he writes this: "Music and silence, how I detest them both. All has been occupied by noise. The grand dynamism, the audible expression of all that is exultant, ruthless, and virile. We will make the whole universe a noise in the end." And so in the book, Screwtape has discovered that people connect with God through music and through silence. But he has found that noise is an effective way of preventing those connection points. And so, even though this is a fictional story, there is still much truth in this statement. Because we live in a society where there is just so much noise today. Whether it's the digital noise of technology, alerts, or notifications, or emails, or texts, or calls. I know immediately I reach for my phone anytime it rings, or dings, or vibrates, just to see who it is, or is it important, whatever it may be. And then on top of that, we're bombarded by the noise of things like politics, and wars, and culture, and various social ideologies, and then the spectrum of opinions that everyone has on these different topics. And then there's just the literal noise of modern life. We can hear traffic rushing past. Wherever you may work or live, there's construction constantly happening, roadworks, airplanes, trains, just the city life that we have. And it's becoming louder and louder in our world, which means it's becoming harder and harder to hear the voice of God amidst all this noise. And so we need to create times of silence. We also need times of stillness. Some of you may have heard Corrie ten Boom saying, "If the devil can't make you sin, he'll make you busy." And this is because both have the same effect in that they cut off our connection to God. And obviously, we can't just quit our jobs, we can't just clear our calendars and live this kind of life of stillness and silence. That's not what I'm suggesting, that's just not even reality. But we can begin to manage the busyness and the noise by intentionally and frequently practicing solitude, which is to spend time with God in stillness and in silence. And so when we read of Jesus in the Gospels, he was a busy man. We often see him surrounded by people, meeting with people, on the go from this place to that place. And yet the Gospels never indicate that he was in a rush, that he was short on time, that he was ever too busy to meet with this person or to hear that request. And one of the primary ways that we see Jesus managing his busyness is through the practice of solitude. So Luke 5:16 says that Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer. And the Greek word that is used there for wilderness is eremos. It means a deserted, a desolate, a solitary and quiet place. So Jesus often withdrew to these spaces to get away from the noise and the busyness of first century life and the busyness of his ministry, where it was just him and his Father. And granted, you're probably thinking, far easier for Jesus. He didn't have Wi-Fi, he didn't have an iPhone, he didn't have the technology that we have, and you're right. Many people are starting to write and to discover that we are the first generations to disciple under Jesus in this technological age. And so it presents challenges that are unique to us in the span of human and Christian history. And yet, at the same time, I know that I don't personally have crowds and crowds of people following me every day, or hanging off my clothing, or literally cutting holes into my roof in order to just, get some time and some space with me. And so, granted, the busyness that we experience is different to the busyness that Jesus experienced, but it is still the same thing. It is still busyness and stuff like that. And so his response to this was to withdraw to these places, to the eremos. And this wasn't a reaction. This was a habitual practice of his. And so we see this because Jesus, right after his baptism, before he has even begun the busy public ministry that we're about to read of, he goes into the eremos, into the wilderness, for 40 days. And then in Mark chapter 1, we have an account of his first days back from this wilderness experience. And so we find him in the town of Capernaum, and it's on the Sabbath, and so he's teaching in the synagogue, and he begins to heal the sick and to cast out demons. And it says that this continues all day long and late into the night. And so he has just gotten back from this 40-day wilderness experience. He's had a very busy but a very successful, first few days of ministry. And I imagine if I was in his shoes, probably at the very least, I would be sleeping in the next morning. I'd probably be having a day off, taking it easy, maybe going out for brunch with Amy or something like that. And yet in verse 35 of Mark chapter 1, we read, before daybreak the next morning, Jesus got up and he went into the eremos to pray. So he goes back into the wilderness to once again be with his Father in solitude, because this was essential to all that Jesus did. And it's not that Jesus was an introvert. The practice of solitude has got nothing to do with your personality type. And nor did Jesus secretly want to be a hermit and just escape from, humanity. It's that he knew the secret of life with God. And it was this pattern of retreat and return, from solitude to community. And he would constantly have this pattern of going back and forth, back and forth. And so God is inviting you into solitude, not so that you can become a monk in some isolated place, cut off from friends and family. We are designed to be in relationship, to have deep and meaningful and loving relationships with one another. But we're also designed for solitude, where it is time with just you and your Heavenly Father, because this is the place that we encounter God, and this is where intimacy is formed with our Father. So for those here that are married or are in a relationship, imagine if the only time that you ever spent with your partner was surrounded by other people. You were always on the go, always in loud and noisy spaces where it was busy and full on. How intimate would that relationship truly be? We all know that intimacy requires time alone together, where it is just you and that person. And this is what solitude is. It's time alone with our Heavenly Father. And it's essential for who we are and for what we do. Henry Nouwen once said that solitude is not a private therapeutic place. It is the place of encounter, where the old self dies and the new self is born. See, when we encounter God in solitude, we often will emerge with a clearer vision of our identity and our calling. And so, contradictory to what society says today, you do not choose and you do not form your identity based on your preferences or sexual orientation or your political ideologies. It's not based on what clothes you wear or car you drive or even what work you do. That identity is something that is God-given. And it is something that we discover in relationship with Him. And so I love how John Mark Comer puts it. He says it's less architecture and more archaeology. Less something that we make up and more something that we unearth from the ground of our being in God. And so when you go into these times of solitude and you encounter God's love, you begin to hear His voice with greater clarity. Begin to hear who He says you are, and the voices of who society says we are or who we should be begin to grow duller and duller. That we find our identity in those times with Him. You'll also gain greater clarity on what you are called to do and what you are not to do, so that you can confidently say yes to God and no to all the other pressures of our society. And whilst solitude may seem like a means of escaping society, Thomas Merton once said, "We do not go into the desert to escape people, but to learn how to find them." So as you begin to encounter God in these spaces and His love in solitude, your heart begins to align itself with His heart, so that you love what He loves and you hate what He hates. And we know that what He loves most is people. It's you, it's me, it's our neighbour, it's the person down the street, it's mankind. And so solitude, yes, it is about you and God. It's about identity and intimacy and relationship, but it's also about you and others. And so the Desert Fathers used to say, we retreat from the world for the world. That there is this pattern of retreat and return. That we aren't to remain in solitude, but we are to go back into community for the sake of our community. And so as you replicate this pattern that Jesus exemplified of retreat and return, you'll begin to notice the difference in yourself as you return to community. That you are a more loving, a more patient, a more forgiving, a more serving, ultimately a more Christ-like person. Because you've been spending time with Him. And so this is the journey that we're all on, that we're all being conformed into the image of the Son, becoming more and more like Jesus each day. And so what might this look like on a practical level? The fact is we don't have the time today to really cover the fullness of what solitude is. And I'm going to recommend a resource at the end of it if you would like to know more. But on one level, solitude is really quite a simple practice. It's just intentionally and frequently practicing times of silence and stillness, where you turn off, you unplug, you put away all inputs and distractions, so it is just you and God. And not that there's anything wrong with connecting with God through worship music or through reading our Bible. These are good practices, but when this begins to be the only way that we connect with, sometimes they can actually add to the noise and we can't hear the voice of God as clear as He wants us to. And so I encourage you to just take time to put that stuff aside. Pick it up again later, but put it aside for a period of time and just wait on God. And depending on your schedule, you could do this first thing in the morning before you get up. You could do this at the end of the day before you go to bed, or any time in between. Personally, as a dad of 3 kids, the mornings are a write-off. I don't even try anymore. I used to think that was the most spiritual time to try and get up early. But man, the earlier you try and get up, the earlier your kids then, are up. And you're frustrated that they're up and they shouldn't be up. And so I've just stopped trying to get up early and do that. And often Sophia will wake up yelling, "Daddy, Daddy," at any time between 5 and 7, wanting to get up and have breakfast and stuff. So I don't do it first thing in the morning. I usually wait till I get to work. And so as a pastor, I have the freedom to, schedule my days around this. But maybe you can't do that. But maybe you can just simply sitting in your car before you get out to go into work, whether it's 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever it is, before you begin the busyness and the things that we do have to do, set some time aside to just be still and to listen. And it doesn't have to be long. The goal is not to prove how spiritual you are by spending hours and hours in silence and stillness. And if you can, awesome. It's just about making that time to draw near to God without the distractions and develop that kind of intimacy that only comes from being alone together without any other inputs. Now, in closing, I will say that this process of encounter often takes longer than we would like it. We have been formed by the culture of, it's now, it's hurried, it's speedy, it's rushed, it's instant. And yet the spiritual life has its own pace, and it is slow. Often it's spent just waiting and just listening. And admittedly, it can feel like a waste of time because we value productivity, we value results, we want to show the outcomes of sitting with God for 5-10 minutes. And it seems like nothing is happening in that time. There's nothing I have to show for it immediately. But through solitude, as we encounter God, we begin to become like this jar, where the contents that were once in turmoil are slowly and not quite there, but are beginning to return to that state of settledness and clarity and just resting. Henry Nouwen called solitude wasting time on God. And so you may not feel the difference in the moment, and it may feel like a waste of time, but you will begin to notice its effects as you return into society, as you go into work, as you come home to your family, as you interact with your community. And so if you would like to learn more about this practice, because there is so many questions that can come with it, and there are a variety of ways that you could do this, then I encourage you to check out this website, practicingtheway.org. It's by an American guy named John Mark Comer. It's completely free, and you will find on it this 4-week practice called Solitude, where they will teach you through a series of videos or podcasts, and there's readings and stuff. You can engage as much or as little as you want, how to kind of implement this into your daily life in a very informative and relevant and practical way. It'll ask, well, what happens when my mind starts to wander? What happens when I start to hear other voices that don't seem like God? This resource will help you answer those questions. And so, to finish, we're going to take communion, but before you partake of the bread and the juice, I want us to just sit in a time of silence and stillness. And the reality is, we're going to hear the kids, we're going to hear the traffic, we're going to hear nature. Unless you have some soundproof box, you're never going to find a place where it is completely still. And it's not about finding your eremos. You don't have to go out into a deserted place. You can just create a space. And so that's what we're going to do this morning. So if you have your Bible or your phone, just put it to the side. Let me just drag this cart. Feel free to come help yourself. If you're next to someone who is unable to maybe get theirs with ease, then feel free to, take it easy, to come and grab theirs. But come grab communion, and just before we partake, I'll chuck a timer on, and we'll just sit in silence and stillness for 5 minutes, and just allow God to speak. Maybe you'll hear something, maybe you won't. And then I'll close this off in prayer, and we can have some time in fellowship. So come grab.